My name is Gene Maddox. The Georgia Clem Multicultural Alliance is a nonprofit here in Greenville, and we're involved in historical events and bringing some diversity and skills and knowledge to the people about, initially with African Americans in the community, but in general, sort of education for everybody as far as historical events are concerned. When I first moved here, I moved here when I was about 2 years old. My family moved here from Western North Carolina, and we were introduced to a historical event here called the 8th of August celebration, and we had no idea what that was about, and then of course we found out it was connected to the freeing of slaves here in 1863, I believe, when President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. And all we knew initially is that the slaves were freed. But as we got more familiar with the process and the celebration every year, it was celebrated annually every year on the 8th of August. It's been celebrated for at least more than 150 years. We learned that the first celebration that was published in the Knoxville newspapers happened in 1871. A group of people in the African American community here got together and sort of formed a procession, riding horses, walking, riding in wagons, marched downtown here in Greenville and formed a sort of parade to Tusculum College, and where the former president, Andrew Johnson, addressed the assembly. And the leader of that parade, or the parade marshal, or president, whatever you would call it, was Sam Johnson. And that was the first time I ever heard of Sam Johnson. And then we found that later, he was possibly, after being freed, he was possibly one that helped spread the celebrating of the 8th of August, starting here in Greenville, and it eventually emerged throughout the state of Tennessee, starting here in East Tennessee and moving down toward Memphis and even across to Mississippi to some places in Missouri, and also up through Kentucky, where it was celebrated up there also. So it appears that Sam Johnson was responsible for the spreading of this celebration down through the years. Well, I don't know a whole lot about Sam Johnson, but that he was one of the 8 to 10 slaves that Andrew Johnson had purchased, and there's one story that comes down to us about the purchase of Sam and his half-sister, Dolly. But I found out that may, as oral history can be, it could be inaccurate. And so the first story that came down to us was that Andrew Johnson was at a slave auction in Patchville, Tennessee, which is a few miles southwest of Greenville here, just, I'm on 10, 15, maybe 20 miles. And that was, as I said, a slave auction. And the first oral story I've heard was that Dolly was walking around looking out at the potential slave buyers, and she spotted Andrew Johnson and thought he looked kind or whatever, I don't know what it was, but that she went up and said, "Would you buy me?" And of course he said yes. And she was supposedly a very young person at that time, maybe no more than 16, I don't, you know. But since that time, and then of course, I heard that he did buy her, but later she asked him, said, "Oh, would you go back and buy my half-brother Sam?" And which he did. But I found out that that story is pretty suspect, and we don't know that that's actually what happened. Well, the difference is, of course, Juneteenth is particular to Texas, southeast Texas. And when President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, it was January of 1863, which he started work on early in 62, but it was issued on the 1st of January 1863. And of course, Juneteenth comes from the fact that the slave owners in Texas ignored that and neglected to tell the slaves that they'd been freed. And of course, they didn't find out the truth until 1865, in which a Union officer went to Texas and informed the slaves, hey, you've been free for a couple of years now. Former slaves in Texas have celebrated that, and so much so until they campaigned to make it the holiday that it is today, which happened this past year. Tennessee, at the time that Mr. Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, Tennessee had been taken over at the event of the war in 1861. 2 years later, the Union Army had captured Nashville and taken over Tennessee. And so President Lincoln needed a military governor, and he appointed Andrew Johnson as military governor of Tennessee in 1862, which it was, the reason is that Tennessee was occupied by the Union Army. And the reason that President Johnson chose Andrew Johnson is that Andrew Johnson had moved here from Raleigh when he was very young and had gotten into politics here in Greenville by running for alderman and then mayor, and then ran for some state offices as representative and then state senator, and eventually he ran for the United States Senate and moved to Washington. Well, one of the stories that I get, and I can't verify this, but Abraham Lincoln had a cousin who lived here by the name of Mordecai Lincoln. And he's the guy that got Johnson interested in politics. The difference is that on the 8th of August, now remember that Mr. Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation in January of 1863. Now, the 8th of August is 8 months later. And one of the situations was that it was deemed that probably expedient for Mr. Lincoln when he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It did not free all the slaves, only the slaves that were in rebellion with the Union. And so when he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, it laid out the states and territories and that would have the slaves freed. The reason is, I think Mr. Lincoln realized that initially, when he was elected president, that he didn't have the authority or the right to free the slaves as it was preserved in the Constitution, due to the southern states not wanting to ratify the Constitution unless slavery was left in. So it was. And so when he issued the proclamation, it only freed slaves that were, as I said, that was in rebellion with the North. One of the other reasons that he appointed Andrew Johnson as the military governor of Tennessee was that in 1861, when the war started and the southern states left the Union, they became the Confederate States of America and moved to Richmond. But Andrew Johnson was the only Southern senator from the South that remained in Washington. And so evidently this put him in good favor with the president. And so since he was the only Southern senator in Washington advocating against the Confederacy, he was appointed military governor. Andrew Johnson, for some reason, decided to free his slaves 8 months after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. Lincoln was elected president in 1860. And he had some support in the border states, namely Kentucky, somewhat here in East Tennessee. And remember I said East Tennessee because East Tennessee was more oriented with the Union and was, as a matter of fact, East Tennessee during the Civil War was more, well, let me say, faithful to the Union than to the Confederacy, because East Tennessee sent more soldiers to fight for the Union than the rest of Tennessee. Matter of fact, they sent quite a few soldiers to fight for the Union. And there was a lot of interest in staying with the Union, as the people who lived in Appalachia, for some reason, I'm not sure which, but they were more faithful to the Union. And that was true here of East Tennessee. And remember, this is where Johnson started his political career in 1860, but he needed to run for re-election in 1864. And he wanted support from the Mid-South or the border states and places like Tennessee. So he thought that if he would put Andrew Johnson on the ticket, that might give him support in this area. And as a matter of fact, if you know that West Virginia became West Virginia after they seceded from the west of Virginia and became West Virginia and stayed with the North. Well, that almost happened here in East Tennessee. For the second time, we would have come the state of Franklin. Now, initially, the state of Franklin, which they tried to set up here in East Tennessee because they felt alienated from Raleigh in North Carolina, which this was a part of North Carolina at the time. But North Carolina wouldn't go for it, so Tennessee just later became part of East Tennessee. And but at this time, that when they were thinking about staying with the North, for the second time they considered going to become the state of Franklin and fight with the North. And I don't know whether Tennessee, I guess maybe Crossville would have been, you wouldn't have got to, you know, if you were here in the state of Franklin, if that had succeeded, you wouldn't have gotten to Tennessee until you got below Knoxville, maybe Crossville. You would have been in Franklin, USA. Now, I understand that a contingent of people in East Tennessee decided to go up and talk to Ben Franklin. And initially, they said this when they wanted to secede from North Carolina, it was Frank Land, L-A-N-D. But when they went to talk to Ben Franklin, they changed it to L-Y-N, Franklin. And so when they get up and talk to Franklin, he says, hey, I don't want nothing to do with that. Y'all go talk to Raleigh about it. So it didn't work. So we remained part of Tennessee, East Tennessee, and eventually Tennessee did secede in '61 when the war started. And of course, as I said, former military governor Johnson stayed in the North, and thereby I was appointed military governor of Tennessee. That was in 1862. But by 1864, President Lincoln, his term was up and he would have to run again, so he needed somebody from the South or from this area to gain support in the election and as a matter of fact, 100 years later, President Kennedy did the same thing. He needed somebody from the South to balance the ticket, so he picked another Johnson, Lyndon Baines Johnson. So the same thing had happened 100 years later, but it was Andrew Johnson. So one of the things that, and you wonder why Johnson waited until the 8th of August to free his slaves. Well, when he was considering running, and this is my summation of what happened, he knew that they were considering him to run for vice president with Lincoln. But there's a problem. He still has slaves in January of 1863. So by August, I guess he's thinking, well, if I'm going to be on a ticket with President Lincoln, who later became the great emancipator, I probably don't need to have slaves. So my thought is that maybe I need to get rid of these slaves. Now, what happened on the 8th of August in 1863 is he freed his 8 to 10 personal slaves. It was a manumission and not an emancipation. An emancipation would have been freeing of all the slaves in Tennessee, which he didn't do. But however, I think there's a record of a letter he wrote to Lincoln prior to that time saying that he thought the moral thing to do would be to free the slaves. And so, now I don't know what happened, but eventually Andrew Johnson did free all the slaves in Tennessee by going through the state legislature, but that happened a year later in October of 1864. He freed all the slaves in the state. And I'm saying, and some of the Knoxville papers at the time said it was political expediency. You know, if I'm going to be the vice president, I don't need to have slaves. And so I'm thinking, hey, maybe that's the reason you did free the slaves. And of course, he did become president upon the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. I think there's a move in some of the southern states to not reveal that history in truth. And I think it's important that we learn the history in all its details and all its truth. And so that's why I think it's important that I've often repeated the story I've just related about Andrew Johnson and why he freed the slaves. And I think that's a truth that that everyone, that all the children, all the students need to know. Of course, after he freed the slaves, and I guess Sam Johnson was here in Greenville along with the other slaves and that had been freed. And I think that they were working to, you know, to live as free. But, you know, after freedom had come to the slaves here, there was a lot of things, you know, there wasn't good education, and they worked to have a worthwhile life while being free, and they didn't have a lot. And now, there's one story that comes down about Sam Johnson and Andrew Johnson as being, it goes back to when he was still a slave with Andrew Johnson. You could hire your slaves out to work for other people. And so there was, and this goes to the independence of Sam Johnson. There was a relative of Andrew Johnson who Sam had been working for as a hired out slave, to other people. And she said, Sam, this was a female relative of Johnson. She said, Sam, I want you to come and work for me. And he goes, no, ma'am, I'm not going to work for you because you don't pay enough. And of course, she's horrified. And if you're a slave, you just didn't do that. And so they would go complain to Andrew Johnson, and he wouldn't do anything about it. Another thing about Sam Johnson was that he was somewhat educated. Now, I don't know how or why or what happened, but he was also a dapper dresser, pretty fancy, and understand that he wore a lot of the clothes that's passed down from Andrew Johnson. And as I say, this is oral, a hearsay, but it's just some of the stories that come down through his family. And you get a lot of stories about his independence. And also, he worked with other people in bringing more progressive, even after slavery. He worked with other people in this community to bring about education and a better life for former slaves. And some of the people he worked with was a person named George Clem. Now, George Clem is the name of the black high school here in Greenville. And it was named for a principal they had named George Clem. But this George Clem that Andrew Johnson was acquainted with or worked with was the grandfather of the George Clem that's named for the school. And so they worked on things like building schools and getting things done here. And he worked with other blacks in the community just to make this a better community for African Americans. There are some other stories that come by, but I think that story sort of illustrates what kind of person Sam Johnson was, and that he was working to make this a better community, as I said, for African Americans or former slaves here. But I do know that Johnson did donate some land for a school. Andrew Johnson freed all the slaves in Tennessee in October of 1864. The former slaves and African Americans in Nashville were still in slavery during that time, even though they'd been freed everywhere else. But they were still slaves here in Tennessee. So a group of African Americans in Nashville knew that if Johnson ran with Lincoln and that he was going to free the slaves, they decided to go down to the governor's mansion, which he's military governor, and congregate to give support to Johnson. And so they went to the governor and saw the milling around out in the yard, and so many of them came that Johnson felt compelled to go out and speak to them. So he went out and he started to speak to them and said, yeah, freedom is coming for you and you're going to be free. And if you don't worry, we're not going to let anybody mess with you, you'll be free. And then he says, what y'all need to get together and organize, you need a Moses to lead you. And it's reported that somebody said, will you be our Moses? And from then on, that became the Moses speech. And after that, it is said that from that time on, all the African Americans, former slaves in Tennessee, considered themselves free, even though the official date was in October of 1864. Now that story comes down from one of the people who provide the oral history about Andrew Johnson and about emancipation here in Tennessee. Now that came to a person who used to just dress as Andrew Johnson and give these speeches. And as far as the legitimacy of that, I don't know. But that's the story that's come down, and is in somewhat of Tennessee's history.
My name is Carol Quinn. So the site consists of 4 units. We administer the cemetery where Andrew Johnson and his family has their burial plot. It is also a military cemetery as well. About 2,000 folks are buried up in the 15 acres that comprise the cemetery. The homestead is also one of our units that we have under our administration. The homestead was built in 1851, and the Andrew Johnson family moved in that year as well. About 80% of what you see in the inside of the building was actually owned by the Johnson family. That's a really high percentage for a National Historic Site, and we owe that to the family because the family actually lived on site until the 1950s. The building that we are currently in right now, what we call the Memorial Building, was built in the 1920s, and it was actually built by the state of Tennessee. And the whole origin of this building is to protect the original tailor shop that Andrew Johnson had. There's no better way to protect a building than to build another building around it. And finally, we also have this, the visitor center and the early home. And the early home is across the street from the visitor center. And that is one of the first homes that the Johnson family lived in. Various members of the family used the building. Sam lived in here, and for the time that he lived there, the census referred to him as a carpenter. So I think Sam was probably a man of many trades, you know, not just carpentry, but he did reside in the former tailor shop, as did his half-sister Dolly at another point, and she started a bakery with her son William. Well, I think that it's really important to remember that Andrew Johnson is a man of very humble beginnings. And I think that his story, his overarching story, is about someone that really persevered and overcame a lot of obstacles in his life. His father passed away when he was a very young boy, and his mother was very impoverished. And he and his brother were apprenticed to a tailor when Andrew Johnson was 9 years old. And he went to live with the tailor and learn a craft. He had never attended one day of school in his entire life. So for him to rise through the political ranks to become the President of the United States after these very humble beginnings is, I think, a really interesting story, but it's also kind of an American story as well. So Andrew Johnson definitely rose through the political ranks. He, was mayor of Greenville. He, again, was alderman at one point, and in 1860 he was elected, or he became a senator from the state of Tennessee. And Abraham Lincoln asked him to be the military governor of the state of Tennessee. So he resigned his seat in the Senate to take on this new role. And the Emancipation Proclamation, which President Lincoln declared January 1st, 1863, didn't apply to the state of Tennessee. So on August 8th, 1863, family lore has it that Andrew Johnson freed his enslaved people. And that kind of began the August the 8th celebration. And why there was a discrepancy between the dates, we don't really know. It might have been to kind of curry political favor, because maybe he was looking forward to the future and thought about his future political career. And he thought that having enslaved people after the Emancipation Proclamation would have been a negative for him. So it's really been said that Andrew Johnson and his wife Eliza were actually really good owners of enslaved people. And that's not to diminish the horrors of slavery, because it was a horrible condition. But as far as that kind of a relationship, the enslaved people of Andrew Johnson probably had it about as good as you could possibly have it. The story goes that Andrew Johnson and Sam would like to walk what is now the cemetery, Andrew Johnson purchased that land in 1851, the same year he purchased the homestead, and he and Sam would take a lot of walks up there. And it was actually Sam who let the family know after Andrew Johnson passed that that's where he wanted to be buried. On one of their walks, Andrew Johnson confided that into Sam. So I think it was about as a positive a relationship that you could possibly have when you're talking about slavery. He was respected, his opinions were valued, and that wasn't always the case with a lot of people that owned enslaved people, that opinion didn't really matter, and that he was listened to. There is also a story that gives you a little bit of insight into Sam Johnson's personality. Charles, Andrew Johnson's son, wrote a letter to Andrew Johnson talking about Sam refusing to do some work for his sister, Martha. Sam was asked to go to Martha's house and chop some wood, and Sam didn't feel that was really something that he wanted to do. He felt it was a little bit beneath him, so he replied that she can, and this is kind of a quote that I'm paraphrasing here, but she can go cut her own damn wood. So it gives you a good insight into Sam's personality and his character. Sure, I think it's really important that, again, we put everything into perspective, but we also take a really hard look at the history that has occurred up to this point, but how we are going to talk about it moving forward. And that's why I think education is so important, has such an important role to play, is that, you know what they say, if you don't study history, you're doomed to repeat it. So obviously we don't want to repeat any of the mistakes that we've had, and we can't really know what mistakes we've had until we've really studied it and researched it. I think that a site like this is really important to the national narrative in that, Andrew Johnson was a very flawed character, without a doubt. But I think he definitely he had his own opinion on things, and I think that the more we study and delve into that, the more we can learn from it. And again, the more that we learn from that, I think hopefully it'll help the narrative moving forward as well. So I think we're at a really pivotal point in our history as far as the Black narrative goes, but it's also really important that, again, we look forward to and say, okay, how can we learn from this?
That America got something right, and that, it was a big deal, and we need to celebrate it. We celebrate everything else, and we have holidays for other accomplishments and other dates that are very important to our history, to our culture. This is definitely, to me, one of the top dates.
Hey Black child, do you know who you are, who you really are? Do you know what you can be, what you want to be, if you try to be what you can be? Hey Black child, do you know where you are going, where you're really going? Do you know what you can learn, what you want to learn, if you try to learn, what you can learn? Hey Black child, do you know that you are strong? Really strong. Do you know what you can do, what you want to do, if you try to do what you can do? Hey Black child, be what you can be, learn what you must learn, do what you can do, and tomorrow your nation will be what you want it to be.